Welcome everybody to this joint Aberdeen Secunia webinar part 1. This is a two-part webinar on Is Your Vulnerability Management Program Leaving You at Risk between Secunia and Derek Brink from the Aberdeen group. It was initiated based on some research results from our side about third-party patching. I will present the first part, the changing threat environment. Then we look at measuring the complexity of endpoints, which is a major factor in securing the enterprise, and then how we can protect limited resources, or how we can protect the enterprise with limited resources. So when we look at the threat environment, it's a very dynamic environment, and as a first order approximation we can map it on two dimensions. Horizontally we have the attacker's expertise, from script kiddie attackers up to highly skilled experts, and vertically we map the motivation of these attackers. That could be just curiosity for personal fame, or they do it for personal gain or finances. Within this map we can clearly map two areas. One is vandalism. Vandalism is basically script kiddies that do not work for personal gain, so it's for fame or out of curiosity. This is less of a problem. However, if personal gain and financial objectives become an incentive, then it's clearly theft. And theft goes through all areas of a wide range of technical expertise of the attacker, from script kiddies up to experts. What we now see is that the underground and cybercrime environment is full of formidable tools to conduct this business, and the experts are the authors of those tools. And experts working for money, this is the fastest growing segment as of now. Now this leads to the situation that tools created by the experts are available and used by less skilled criminals, and they are used for personal gain. So this means that we have more opportunistic attacks, and we have basically a very low entry threshold. Everybody with the respective mindset can enter the criminal crime scene or start a career as a cyber criminal, and there's no requirement of high technical skills. So when you have malware nowadays can systematically bypass your perimeter defense, be it antivirus, intrusion detection and prevention systems, or firewalls, or anti-malware products. To understand how cybercriminals operate to bypass those perimeter defense systems, we have to understand the malware development process. This is a well orchestrated and deployed process that cybercriminals nowadays use. In the first step, cybercriminals create the original malware with the core functionality of the malware. This is like doing an attack, stealing privacy data, sniffing, spreading the infection, and so on. They do it either by hiring programmers that do it, or they buy tools, like there are malware construction kits out there that allow you to construct a Trojan or infect files to create malware just with a click, drag and drop interface. Very, very easy to use. In step 2, criminals now create permutation or variants of their malware. The goal is to obfuscate the malware. By creating multiple serial variants, they make a large number of samples of their malware in order to bypass antivirus and detection systems. So they now have, say, 10,000 or 100,000 automatically generated variants of their original malware, which implies that to capture those, you need, with a signature-based system, at least 10 or 100,000 different signatures just to capture this one malware. The next step is quality assurance. So they do not just blindly fire those newly created samples against the targets, but they do first quality assurance internally. They test their samples or creations against all major up-to-date antivirus engines. If a sample is detected, it goes back to step 2, new permutation is generated. If the sample is not detected, then it is used in the deployment. So nowadays, if there's a targeted attack, you can rest assured that only malware variants that pass quality assurance, that are not detected by antivirus, are used for attacks at the day of deployment. So to visualize this arms race between cybercriminals that create millions of variants and the antivirus industry, Symantec reported about 280 million new virus samples found or counted in 2010. To put this into perspective, this equals more than 700,000 samples a day or more than 30,000 samples an hour. So this is truly an arms race that we are about to lose with reactive technologies. So this arms race and this malware development process is very effective in bypassing antivirus. NSS Labs, this is an independent testing lab that looks at the security of security products in the markets that do independent testing and measurements. They tested 123 old publicly known exploits against the top 10 prevention software in Q3 2010. What they found is that 25% of those exploits were missed by the top 10 prevention software. To remind you, those are publicly known old exploits. Those were exploits from the Metasploit exploitation framework. This is a freely available tool for penetration testing. It is guaranteed that the exploits in there work and they are very, very easy to use. Basically, it's script kiddie stuff. So 25% of those exploits were missed by prevention software. NSS Labs went then a step further and they simulated step 3 in the malware development process. So they slightly tweaked the exploits by retaining the same core functionality but by making it look a little bit different. And those tweaked exploits were again fired against the top 10 prevention software, and now 40% of the exploits were missed. So we see clearly bypassing traditional perimeter defense is possible, and malware authors are very effective in doing so. This also explains why Damballa, a company specializing in finding botnet infections within enterprises, found that up to 9% of the endpoints in large enterprises to be bot infected. So those were enterprises that could afford and can afford and deploy best of breed perimeter protection, firewalls, IDS, IPS, antivirus, and still up to 9% of the endpoints in a well-defended environment are found infected. So, if even this is too much, you can buy and start your career with malware as a service. This is a sample of an underground tool. It's called Turkoyan. In the Gold Edition, they provide you a 6-month unlimited replacement warranty if this creation gets detected by any antivirus. So this malware is offered for $249, including this service level agreement. So we see this is a very professional cybercrime environment. Tools are available and tools are rather effective. The question is now, from a cybercriminal's perspective, what does it mean? The availability of tools, this arms race. So we could say in a first order approximation that opportunity from a criminal's perspective is the number of hosts times the number of vulnerabilities. It is estimated that nowadays over 2 billion people have a connection or internet access in the world. So this is a 31% penetration of the population, or a growth of over 400%. With over 2 billion targets or potential targets, it becomes clear that corporate as well as private endpoints are increasingly targeted by cybercriminals. So if you look at endpoints, we first find that endpoints are very difficult to secure. If you compare it to a server has just a single purpose. It is a web server, it's a database server, or it's a DNS server. It can be hardened and it's a static environment. The server doesn't go surfing. The server doesn't read and receive emails. The server doesn't tweet or watch movies. So it's a static environment. At the opposite, endpoints are very dynamic environment, and we have this coupled with unpredictable usage pattern by its users. The way we use an endpoint today is different from the way we used it a few years ago, or the way we will use it in a few years. There's a constant influx of new technologies and plugins that enable us to do all the things we need to do and we want to do with our computers to access and use the internet. On the other hand, endpoints are where the most valuable data is found to be the least protected. At the end of the day, whatever means you have to protect your data is accessible by your endpoint. You don't go down to the server rack to do your work. At the end of the day, your data to conduct your business by definition must be available to an endpoint PC. So this makes endpoints a very valuable target for cyber criminals. On the endpoint, the data is also the most exposed because this is where we serve, where we receive emails, where we chat, and so on. So this is a large attack surface compared to a server environment. Further, everybody is a valuable target for cyber criminals. We often hear people say, yeah, but I don't have valuable data, I have nothing to hide, so I'm not attractive. So, first of all, an automated script cannot differentiate on whether you think you're an interesting target or not. If you're vulnerable, you get owned. This is one thing. The other thing, just your infrastructure, your CPU and bandwidth is a valuable target for cyber criminals. For example, with your CPU, they can offer password cracking services in the cloud. With your bandwidth, they can misuse you as a proxy to hide their maldoing, or they can launch further attacks or DDoS attacks. So even if you don't have anything to hide or nothing interesting on your environment, you are a valuable target for cyber criminals. Everyone is a target. So let's look at the number of vulnerabilities. The question is, how many programs do we have installed on a typical endpoint? Turns out that this is a rather hard question to answer, and to look deeper into it, I looked at data from our free tool, the Secunia Personal Software Inspector. This is a lightweight software inspector or scanner which identifies insecure programs on a Windows machine. So it identifies programs and plugins. It correlates this information with our vulnerability intelligence to find out which programs have missing patches. It can, on top of that, automatically install missing patches for an increasing range of software products. We right now have more than 4 million active PSI users. So based on this data, we found that typically 50% of the users have more than 66 programs from more than 22 vendors installed. This is quite a diversity we found on their endpoints. So 66 programs is a large number. There are basically 66 attack vectors. On the other hand, those 66 programs coming from 22 vendors means that if you want to patch this system, you have to master at least 22 different update mechanisms, because each and every vendor has its own update mechanism. We'll talk later a little bit about the complexity of doing so. Now, to capture this diversity, we built a representative software portfolio. So by taking the top 50 most prevalent programs we found in the field, we built the top 50 software portfolio in order to security track endpoint security. In this top 50 software portfolio, we have software from 14 different vendors, whereas 26 are Microsoft programs and 24 are third-party programs. When we look at the evolution of the number of vulnerabilities affecting a typical endpoint with Windows XP in the top 50 software portfolio, we found an alarming trend. The number of vulnerabilities affecting a typical endpoint rose more than 3 times in the last 3 years, from about 200 in 2007 to over 700 in 2010. So this is an increase of a factor of 3.25 in 3 years, or of 71% from 2009 to 2010 alone. This is an alarming trend, and it's a relevant trend because most of those vulnerabilities are either highly or extremely critical, are exploitable from remotely, and provide system access to the attacker. The question is now, what is the source of this increasing trend? Is it vulnerabilities in the operating system? Is it vulnerabilities in the Microsoft programs, or vulnerabilities in third-party programs? When we analyzed the data, we found that third-party programs are almost exclusively responsible for this increasing trend. So a typical endpoint in 2010 with Windows XP in the top 50 portfolio has only 13% of the vulnerabilities in the operating system, or 18% of the vulnerabilities in the Microsoft programs, and a whopping 69% of the vulnerabilities affecting this endpoint are found in third-party programs. Again, looking at the situation from a cybercriminal's perspective, we can say, okay, 31%, this is what you usually patch, because you can patch this with Microsoft Update. This is the operating system and the 26 Microsoft programs. However, even if you patch this fully at the day of first patch availability, cybercriminals just don't care, because there's tons of opportunity in the 69% of the third-party program vulnerabilities. To look at it from another angle, we can also say that in 2010 the 24 third-party programs had 3.8 times more vulnerabilities than the 26 Microsoft programs, or about 5 times more vulnerabilities than the operating system. This picture is consistent across the different operating systems, as we see here on the right, and we also see that the third-party programs are mostly responsible for this increase and for the largest part of all vulnerabilities on those endpoints. Now, what's the role of the operating system? What if we change from Windows XP to Windows 7? Well, changing the operating system together with having the same top 50 software portfolio that represents a typical endpoint, the number of vulnerability on the machine only goes down by less than 3%. So this effect is not significant at all. However, get me right, Windows 7 is much more secure than Windows XP, but as most vulnerabilities are found in the third-party programs, there still remains a very large attack surface. The question now is, how do we keep a typical endpoint up to date? When we again look at the share of vulnerabilities, we can say we can patch all the operating system and Microsoft programs with one update mechanism, which is Microsoft Update, and thereby we cover 31% of the vulnerabilities. On the other hand, to patch the remaining 69% of the vulnerabilities, we need to master an additional 13 different update mechanisms. As I remember, the top 50 software portfolio has software from 14 different vendors. One is Microsoft and 13 third-party vendors. So we end up with 13 different update mechanisms. This is quite a complex task to master so many different update mechanisms, and cybercriminals know that the availability of a patch does not imply that the patch is installed. So, patch complexity has an effect on the security, and it has a measurable effect on the security. When we look at the average patch level over the last 12 months, we find that 3.6% of the Microsoft programs are insecure, compared to more than double, 8.3% of the third-party programs to be insecure. You see on this plot in blue the average patch level of the Microsoft programs, with a dip at the patch day and a sharp increase when people start to implement the patches, and we see in red the patch level of the third-party programs, which is systematically and significantly lower over time. So, having said all this, the question is, are we doomed? Not at all. The good news is, when we look at the patch availability for all the programs in the top 50 portfolio for the last 24 months, we find that 65% of the vulnerabilities had a patch available at the day of first disclosure of the vulnerability. So this means that in 65% of the cases we can do something on the spot, and patch availability rises to 75% within 10 days. So, as we said before, cybercriminals, they don't need Microsoft vulnerabilities. They have more than plenty opportunities in the third-party programs, and on top of that, cybercriminals don't need zero-day patches. they have more than enough opportunity in exploiting unpatched unpatched third-party programs. So 65% of the vulnerabilities can be patched because a patch is available at the day of first disclosure. So this is a mission, this is an hour table here, we can do something, and there's no reason that we are paralyzed by the threat of how to defend zero-day exploits. Further, a patch provides better protection than thousands of signatures because a patch eliminates the root cause. If cybercriminals create tens and thousands of different permutations of their attack, antivirus is captured in an arms race and they have to produce the same number of signatures and other defense mechanisms. However, when the vulnerability is patched, you essentially stop this arms race because you eliminated the root cause. Therefore, a patch is a very effective means or an effective security measure. The question now is, especially for larger environments, what if you can't patch all the programs? So, to shed some light on this situation, we do an analysis and a simulation. So we look at the portfolio with the 200 most prevalent programs found. And we assume that we only have the resources to patch 10 programs every year. The question now is, how do we choose those 10 programs? We compare two strategies. One is a static strategy, so every year we patch the top 10 most prevalent programs. So I determined the top 10 most prevalent programs in 2010, and every year we patch those 10 programs. On the other hand, this is a dynamic approach. Every year we patch the top 10 most critical programs. So when we look at the total risk based on the 200 programs, the red curve shows the weighted risk based on the programs and the vulnerabilities and the criticality of the vulnerabilities found. So the red curve is increasing as expected with increasing number of vulnerabilities, and this represents the total risk of an entirely unpatched top 200 portfolio. Now, if you look at the blue curve, this is the risk remediated by patching the 10 most prevalent programs. This is the static approach. By patching 10 out of those 200 programs, our average risk reduction over the last 6 years is 31%. If again we only patch 10 programs, but as shown in green, the 10 most critical programs every year, our average risk reduction is way higher. It is on average 71%. So by patching the 10 most critical programs every year, we effectively reduce the risk due to unpatched vulnerabilities by 71%. Or we can also look at this from another perspective. Let's say the risk appetite we have is 80%, which means that we want to remediate 80% of the risks due to unpatched software vulnerabilities. If you look at the static strategy in blue, this means that you have to patch up to 37 programs, or the top 37 most prevalent programs. However, if you have a risk-based approach, if we patch the top critical programs, we get the same risk reduction by just patching the 12 top critical programs. So, knowing what to do really pays out. So the same 80% risk reduction is achieved by either patching the 12 most critical programs or by patching the 37 most prevalent programs. This means an investment in tools that show you what are the critical programs, what are the criticality of the vulnerabilities in your environment. This investment more likely pays out as it can make good on the resources side on the patches that you have to deploy. So, to conclude, there's no silver bullet technology, and we still perceive Microsoft as the primary attack vector, thereby ignoring the larger risk of third-party programs. This is like locking the front door while the back door remains wide open. Second, patching should be prioritized as a primary security measure given its effectiveness. This is visualized through the arms race with perimeter defense vendors and the signatures. And last but not least, knowing what to do pays off handsomely. It's better to know where the risks are, what you can do, and you can save a lot of resources to get the same risk reduction by knowing exactly where to deploy patches. So, thank you very much for your attention. This was the part 1 of this joint webinar with Aberdeen. You see here part 2 of the webinar. You can download it from our website, and I hope you enjoyed part 2 with Derek Brink from Aberdeen. Thank you very much.